Behind every great fortune lies a great crime. But what if the greatest crime is the system itself? We live in a world where a small fraction of the population, a class set above the rest, controls vast swaths of land, labor, and capital, beyond what any one of us could possibly accumulate by the sweat of our brow, thanks to the history of conquest that built the modern economy. Indeed, nearly every patch of land on Earth is claimed by one state or another, to dispose of according mostly to the whims of the ruling classes, whether local or foreign. But such theft is not treated as the great crime that it is. Rather, it is seen as legitimate, as proper, as inviolable as one's home or toothbrush, as rightful property. But throughout history, what counts as property has changed dramatically, and often through violence. The version of the opening quote that I heard was, "All great wealth begins with theft." In 1840, the anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon memorably declared, "Property is theft." One might dismiss this expression as simply nonsensical. How could property be theft if the concept of theft relies on the acceptance of property? But we can dig a bit deeper than surface level impressions. After all, in the same book, What is Property?, he would also declare property is impossible. Clearly, such a familiar word as property contains a world of meaning. In this video, I want to disentangle the concept of property, examine the forms it has taken throughout history, make sense of Proudhon's infamous declarations, and put forward how anarchists like myself rethink property as we aim toward freedom for all. Even the simplest language hides complexity. Property can mean the clothes on your back, the car you drive around, or the factory you own. Capitalists might prefer to obscure their specifically exploitative form of property from scrutiny by blurring the distinctions. But property evidently refers to different things, so it's necessary for us to clarify the uses of the term. The word itself comes from the Latin proprius, meaning one's own, or what is proper to oneself. Property can refer to the qualities of a person or thing, or it can refer to a person's right to control a thing. Proudhon uses the example of a magnet to make this point. Thus, in the phrase, iron acquires the property of a magnet, the word property does not convey the same idea that it does in this one. I have acquired this magnet as my property. To tell a poor man that he has property because he has arms and legs, that the hunger from which he suffers and his power to sleep in the open air are his property, is to play upon words and to add insult to injury. Property can refer to a matter of fact, as in your actual possession and use, or it can refer to a matter of right, as in legal property, which you own and control regardless of your possession. The tenant is a possessor, the landlord is a proprietor. Property can be legally classified as real property, which are immovable assets like land and buildings, or chattel property, which are movable assets like furniture and vehicles. Anarchists might also draw a distinction between ownership for personal use, as in personal property, and ownership for profit, as in private property. Historically, the aim of anarchist revolutionary expropriation has been to socialize the property used to exploit labor, like factories, not to claim individual possessions like homes. The law may define, recognize, and enforce particular forms of property, but there is something to the idea of ownership that transcends law. Even in the absence of law, humans develop norms and customs, including around some sense of ownership, be it individual or communal. In fact, even in our present legal order, our behavior is still shaped more by custom than by law. It's considered impolite to take someone's seat if they step away from it for a moment. It's their own, even though they have no legal entitlement to it. When we think of the concept of ownership and property, if we go back to the Latin proprius, one's own or what is proper to oneself, we inevitably confront the concept of the self. It is said that before we can claim to own anything else, ownership begins with the natural right to control our own body, labor, and consciousness. That basis of self-ownership can then be extended to encompass possessions like clothes or the home as aspects of the extended self. But that's just one perspective. In his article, How Does Property Become Capitalist?, anarchist Sean Wilbur critically describes self-ownership as paradoxical, because it appears to require a person be both the owner and the thing owned at the same time. Alternatively, it poses the idea that the body is somehow owned by a disembodied self, a concept of self-ownership that can be stretched to serve the purpose of naturalizing capitalist property relations by claiming each person is a sort of mini capitalist enterprise, where the self manages the capital body to maximize returns on its investment. What constitutes the self is pretty philosophically contentious, and I don't expect to resolve millennia of debate about its nature, being material or immaterial, static or dynamic, existent or illusory, right here and now. It seems to me that in any case we make sense of our self, whatever it is and however far it extends, in relation to the other, both in objects and in persons. We may not have a philosophically unassailable idea of what the self is, but our social interactions provide us with a dynamic, workable approximation. This is sufficient for the relevant question here, which is not what the self ultimately is, but what can properly be said to belong to it. What is recognized as one's own comes down to social agreement, either through the consent of custom or the imposition of law. Actual possession may or may not be a relevant consideration in determining what is proper to the self. Under the status quo, you might occupy a house, but if you don't have title or tenancy, you'll be evicted by force. It's not your property. On the other hand, stock investors may never physically possess what they buy, but our social agreement in the law treats their ownership as legitimate. As author Charles Eisenstein observed in Sacred Economics, the fictive nature of ownership is not a recent phenomenon. The famous money of the Yap Islanders, huge stone rings that are too heavy to move, can nonetheless change owners quite easily when everyone agrees that so-and-so is the new owner. In the modern world, even as our social norms continue to play a role, the law is the ultimate arbiter of property. Without going into an exhaustive history of property on every continent, I want to focus on the relevant, long-standing influence of Roman law, because it laid the foundation for the civil law tradition that governs much of the world today. And though distinct in other ways, even common law couldn't avoid some inspiration from Roman law on matters of property. According to Proudhon, Roman law defined property as the right to use and abuse one's own within the limits of the law. Jus utendi et abutendi re sua, quatenus juris ratio patitur. In The Dawn of Everything, anthropologists David Graeber and David Wengrow note that Roman law actually confers three basic rights related to property: the right to use said property, the right to enjoy the products of said property, and the right to damage or destroy said property. It was according to this framework that Roman law encoded the treatment of people, the enslaved, and to some extent women and children, as the property of the head of the household. This wasn't unique to Roman law, by the way. The Jewish law that would later influence Christian and Islamic laws also enshrined the property status of enslaved people, and to some extent women and children, under the householder's legal authority. Rome's continual warfare supplied a steady influx of captives who, as property, served the empire's agricultural and domestic economy. The Roman law on slavery survived the fall of the Western Empire well into the medieval era. The post-fall period would also see the gradual emergence of serfdom across Europe. Serfs were not chattel property, but they were legally bound to privately owned land. Slavery, in the spirit of Roman legal precedent, became a critical institution in the plantation colonies of European empires from the 15th century onward. This demand would be supplied by the mass capture and sale of various peoples, primarily along the coast of Western and Central Africa. Black and white as racial categories were invented for the purpose of upholding the newly established colonial order. According to historian Hilary Beckles, the business model of slavery in the towns and plantations of the New World was based legally, economically, and socially on the enslaved black women as chattel. This isn't to minimize the subjugation of enslaved black men, but due to the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, the black woman was the biological and legal carrier of chattel property status. She was a source of workforce, reproduced herself, and provided socio-sexual pleasures under the constraint of her owner. The slave trade facilitated European and American economic development, but the institution would be gradually abolished over the course of the 19th century. The causes of abolition vary from diminishing economic returns, to the rise of industrial capitalism, to the influence of anti-slavery activism, to the self-emancipation of enslaved people through rebellion and maroonage. Slavery in various forms was not unique to the Romans or their European successors. The trafficking of people as property predates those empires and could be found across the world. Even today, slavery endures as defined by the 1926 League of Nations Convention to suppress the slave trade and slavery. The status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised, and slave meaning a person in such condition or status. As for the status of women as property, we have patriarchy to thank for that. Patriarchy refers to a system in which men control political power, economic resources, family life, and social institutions, and uphold social norms that privilege men and restrict women. Under patriarchy, women lack the right to own property or retain their own earnings, which would instead go to the male household head, either their father or their husband. As historian Catherine Hesse noted, the free male householder, called paterfamilias in Roman sources and Baal Habayit in rabbinic texts, held the highest authority within his family and household. Hesse notes that both rabbinic and Roman legal terminology minimize the distinction between a free wife and a slave by emphasizing their dependence on the male householder. Slaves and wives were objects of male possession, and he was at liberty to make use of their sexuality and labor. For both the Romans and the Israelites, a wife could be acquired through rape. In The Creation of Patriarchy, historian Gerda Lerner described a spectrum of degrees of unfreedom, ranging from the slave woman to the free wife. While free women might have had agency in other respects, their sexuality and reproductive capacity remained male property. Author Anna Mae Duane argues that 19th century abolitionists focused extensively on the sexual abuse of female slaves, arguing that it was morally wrong to treat any woman, even those who were owned, as sexual property. However, in doing so, they brought other institutions that rendered a woman's sexual consent unnecessary under scrutiny. Institutions like marriage, where a wife had neither the right to own property herself nor the right to deny her husband access to her own body. Which brings us full circle to that thorny question of self-ownership. As abolitionist and feminist Lucy Stone inquired, has woman the right to herself? All the rest means little if I may not keep my own body, and its uses, in my absolute right. This right continues to be threatened and flagrantly violated across the world today. As for children, they have sometimes been treated as though they were property throughout history. In ancient Mesopotamia, according to historian John Nicholas Reed, children were used as collateral, seized for debts or offenses, and sold outright. Going back to rabbinic and Roman law, householders had total authority over the bodies of their children and slaves, deciding where they would live, what they would wear, what foods they would eat, and how they would be punished. If, according to historian Richard Saller, one of the primary distinctions between the condition of a free man and a slave in the Roman mind was vulnerability of the latter to corporal punishment, in particular lashings at another man's private whim, then in that respect children were certainly no freer than the enslaved. However, as Hesse notes, whereas the child would eventually grow into an adult person and had to be treated with this future development in mind, the slave's personhood was denied. Fast forward to the present day, and although chattel slavery has been abolished and children are not legally defined as property, many legal systems continue to grant parents and guardians extensive rights of control that uncomfortably resemble proprietary authority in practice. Duane recounts a panel at an anti-slavery conference where a scholar argued that a child forced into prostitution was clearly a slave, while a young girl forced into marriage was merely subject to a cultural practice immune from being described as slavery. Although both girls would endure sexual violence, only the commercially exploited child was recognized as enslaved. The same reasoning is applied to exclude unpaid domestic labor and family farm work, which are viewed as extensions of parental authority within the private household, and thus do not attract the label of slavery or comparable public scrutiny. Modern legal systems reject many of the most explicit forms of human ownership, yet the debates surrounding forced labor, bodily autonomy, and children's rights show that the boundaries of self-ownership are still being contested. Thankfully, when most people hear the word property today, they don't think of other human beings. They think of houses, farms, businesses, and especially land. Yet the legal order that once justified ownership over persons also helped define ownership over territory. To understand how land came to be treated as private property in most of our modern legal systems, we must return once again to Roman law. Eisenstein recognized there is a vast conceptual gulf between having a right to the fruits of one's labor as applied to land and owning the land itself. In Rome, he writes, land came under dominium, the ultimate right, the right which had no right behind it, the right which legitimated all others while itself having no need of legitimation, which, as you may recall, was the right of using, enjoying, and abusing, jus utendi, fruendi, abutendi. Now, in the medieval era, property was a bundle of overlapping rights rather than absolute ownership in the modern sense, as kings, lords, tenants, and commoners could all have legally recognized interests in the same land. Over the course of centuries, the enclosure movement would transform common land into private property, a process which would be paralleled across Europe, especially following the abolition of serfdom. To be clear, such commons were not ownerless land. While Eisenstein uses rhetoric like a commons, the property of all and of none, they were still managed property, owned by a specific community, lord, parish, or manor, with access limited to those with the rights to that common. Before enclosure, farmers cultivated scattered strips individually during the growing season, after which fields were opened for communal grazing and other customary uses. Enclosure ended these common rights by fencing or otherwise privatizing the land. At the same time, European powers claimed land overseas, where colonial expansion was driven by the appropriation of indigenous territories across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. Indigenous customary systems of land tenure were frequently dismissed because they did not resemble European legal notions of property. Colonists declared vast territories terra nullius, nobody's land, or argued that land that wasn't enclosed, permanently cultivated, or held under recognizable title was effectively unused and thus ripe for their claim. Colonial governments surveyed territory, imposed cadastral maps, issued deeds and titles, and converted landscapes into parcels that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and taxed. In doing so over the course of centuries, the earth was cut up into tracts of property, so defined by legal ownership. There's an anonymous poem called The Goose and the Common from the early 19th century, which I think is especially relevant to this global history of privatization. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose, who steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine, who take things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure, those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack, till they go and steal it back. With this slice of the history of property in mind, you may already have a sense of why Proudhon would declare that property is theft. The private owner was one who took from what was common or unowned, their property bought in blood and legitimized by deed. As Eisenstein noted, if property is robbery, then a legal system dedicated to the protection of private property rights is a system that perpetuates a crime. By making property sacrosanct, we validate the original theft. This should not be too surprising if the laws were made by the thieves themselves to legitimize their ill-gotten gains. Such was indeed the case. In Rome and elsewhere, it was the rich and powerful who both seized the land and made the laws. But Proudhon's argument is even more interesting and expansive than a simple condemnation of enclosure and colonization. In What is Property, Proudhon methodically dismantles the arguments made in favor of private property as defined by law as the right to use and abuse one's own. I'll cover just a few of his arguments. First, to those who claim property is a natural right, Proudhon argues that natural rights must belong equally to all. Liberty, equality, and security for one necessarily affirms them for everyone else. But legal property does not meet this standard because it is exclusive. One person's legal claim to the land denies others, contradicting everyone's equal natural right to the earth, separating society into those few who have and those many who do not. Proudhon then reviews several philosophical justifications for property and argues that they all confuse justifications for possession with justifications for private property. Beginning with the Roman doctrine of first occupancy, Proudhon argues that occupation justifies only possession according to use, not permanent perpetual ownership according to title. Cicero's analogy of seats in a public theatre makes this clear. Each person may occupy one seat, but no one has the right to monopolize several indefinitely while others are excluded. Some claim that the fixed and finite nature of land justifies property. Proudhon counters that precisely because land, like air or water, is a gift of nature essential to all, its scarcity strengthens the case against exclusive ownership and instead calls for equitable stewardship. Appeals to universal consent fare no better. Proudhon's argument focuses on the fact that since access to the means of labor is necessary for human freedom, no legal contract can legitimately alienate workers from those means. Contracts derive their legitimacy from equality between the parties, whereas private property creates inequality. But I would add that universal consent in some social contract has never and will never exist. None of us alive today had a say in the establishment of the property regime, and our consent can't be withdrawn without violent consequences. The idea that labor justifies property is famously attributed to the liberal philosopher John Locke. He proposed that just as individuals own themselves, they also own the labor performed by their bodies. When an individual mixes their labor with unowned nature, that labor adds value which justifies property ownership. Proudhon rejects this. Labor might justify possessing and using the means of production, but it cannot justify property. Property only comes into being when the law steps in, granting entitlements beyond simple possession. And the law said so is hardly a sufficient justification for the suffering that the property system produces. Even if we accept the premise that labor applied to the means of production justified its ownership, then the working class should own the means of production, not the current owners. Proudhon here introduces the concept of collective force. Workers working together create more than the sum of their individual efforts, a surplus which the owning class appropriates as profit. Labor therefore cannot be the basis of property, since property's primary function under capitalism is to enable those who do not labor to appropriate the products of those who do. Proudhon goes further still. He says that labor can never establish an absolute claim to property because production itself is irreducibly social. Every worker depends on the labor, knowledge, and cooperation of countless others. The farmer depends on the work of builders, manufacturers, transporters, and educators, just as those workers rely on the farmer. What appears to be an individual product is in reality a social product. With this interdependence in mind, we might retain individual possession and use, but not permanent, exclusive property. In The System of Economic Contradictions, published a few years later, Proudhon develops these insights into a broader critique of capitalism. The text was later overshadowed and sorely mischaracterized thanks to the efforts of Karl Marx and his followers. But in his article correcting Marx's mischaracterizations, anarchist Ian McKay succinctly summarizes Proudhon's critique. If you wanted a quick takeaway, this is it. Capitalism divides society into owners of productive property and workers who only own their labor. Deprived of independent access to the means of production, workers must sell that labor to survive. Their employers command the labor process and appropriate not only the workers' individual labor, but also the collective force generated through their cooperation. Exploitation therefore arises because ownership of the means of production allows one class to command the labor of another and claim the wealth it creates. As socialist Thomas Hodgkin famously wrote, "Betwixt him who produces food and him who produces clothing, betwixt him who makes instruments and him who uses them, in steps the capitalist, who neither makes nor uses them, and appropriates to himself the produce of both." Property, not possession but the legally protected ownership of the means of production that gives owners the authority to control production and appropriate the products and surplus created by wage labor, is theft. Or, as Proudhon put it far more memorably, property is theft. This capitalist theft is enforced and protected by the laws of the state. Aside from social inertia, which reflects the workers' acceptance of the status quo due to ideological conditioning, what prevents the workers from taking control of the means of production themselves is the force of the state. Both property and the state share in common a claim to absolute, exclusive mastery over a territory and all within it. The modern state, as sociologist Max Weber famously described it, is the institution that claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. It is this monopoly that allows it to enforce the property claim of the owner class against the workers who would challenge them. It is this monopoly that upholds a further 4 monopolies that maintain capitalist dominance, as identified by anarchist Benjamin Tucker: money, land, tariffs, and patents. Land and patents are most relevant to this discussion of property. The money monopoly refers to the privilege given by the government to certain individuals, or to individuals holding certain kinds of property, of issuing the circulating medium. The land monopoly refers to the state's enforcement of titles that do not rest on personal occupancy or cultivation. This enables property owners to exclude others from land, charge rent, maintain artificial scarcity, and profit from speculative real estate investment, reinforcing the inequality between landowners and the landless, and creating our current crisis of homelessness. Beyond its social effects, the land monopoly has profound environmental consequences. States claim ownership of forests, minerals, and other natural resources before granting privileged access to extractive industries, allowing them to exploit ecosystems while externalizing the social and ecological costs. As anarchist Peter Gelderloos argues in his article on the ecological crisis in Catalonia, this legal fiction of land having an owner polices and erases the complex web of relations people have with land in the real world. He also finds that, in the real world, the state's pretension that a living being can be isolated from other living beings isn't working out. The tariff monopoly refers to the use of tariffs to protect domestic producers from foreign competition by taxing imported goods. Tucker argues that this system shielded politically connected domestic industries from international competition, enabling them to extract higher profits through artificially inflated prices, while forcing consumers to absorb the higher costs from the resultant inefficiencies. Rather than protecting domestic labor, the tariff monopoly ends up primarily serving domestic capital. Last but not least, the patent monopoly refers to the protection of property rights over ideas, creations, and inventions, allowing certain individuals or firms to demand tribute from others for the use of such things that would otherwise be given freely to the wider intellectual commons. Way back when, our stories, music, motifs, and most inventions formed an intellectual commons that everyone could enjoy, use, and build upon. New techniques would spread from place to place. New stories would travel and be transformed with each unique retelling. As anarchist Peter Kropotkin wrote in The Conquest of Bread, every machine has had the same history, a long record of sleepless nights and of poverty, of disillusions and of joys, of partial improvements discovered by several generations of nameless workers, who have added to the original invention these little nothings, without which the most fertile idea would remain fruitless. Each discovery, each advance, each increase in the sum of human riches owes its being to the physical and mental travail of the past and the present. By what right then can anyone whatever appropriate the least morsel of this immense whole and say, "This is mine, not yours"? We stand on the shoulders of giants, inheriting and contributing to a living commons. What appears to be an individual product, we find yet again to be a social product. Individual property rights are not necessary, as is sometimes argued, to incentivize creativity. Humans have produced art, music, literature, scientific discoveries, and technological innovations for millennia before the emergence of patents and copyrights. Necessity, curiosity, craftsmanship, the desire to solve problems, and the pursuit of social recognition have always been powerful motivators in their own right. Ideas are non-rivalrous, meaning one person's use of an idea doesn't prevent another person from using it as well. And ideas can be shared and reproduced at little or no cost. In fact, ideas become more valuable the more widely they are shared, tested, criticized, and adapted. We now face a state-enforced artificial scarcity of that which is only possible through collective effort. It is primarily megacorporations, not individual artists or inventors, that have become the principal beneficiaries of this intellectual property regime. They fence off art, invention, and even seeds and life-saving medicine from free exchange, impeding the flourishing of human life and the full realization of our inventive and creative potential, and thus our freedom. Anarchist Kevin Carson notes that the enclosure of ideas causes gross price distortions, since beyond the actual cost of labor and materials, owners can restrict production of their product and charge rent in the form of increased prices merely for their ownership of the trademark, patent, or copyright. This isn't to say that we should deny creators their recognition or reward. Far from it. But the patent monopoly, as part and parcel of this broader capitalist order, is hardly the only or best means of supporting art and innovation. These four monopolies enforced by the state have ensured that the owning class can seize the products of collective labor while excluding everyone else from their benefits. Again, we say property is theft. Yet, Proudhon also declared property is impossible. What did he mean by that? In chapter 4 of What is Property, Proudhon says that property owners will claim, in response to his critiques of property, that equality is impossible. Equality is a fairly contentious word. I have a side channel video addressing its meanings. According to Wilbur, in his article Toward a General Theory of Anarchy, equality was an extremely important keyword for Proudhon. Society, for example, was essentially a synonym, in the sense that equality was the primary precondition for relations worth calling social. But Proudhon was at the same time very skeptical of any sort of material equality, so equality became, through its commutative and progressive character, closely connected to reciprocity, defined by Proudhon as the mutual penetration of antagonistic elements, and roughly synonymous with justice, which he understood in terms of the balance of interests among equals. Proudhon's use of equality in the context of his critique of property refers to the equality of access to the means of life that would establish the reciprocity and balance necessary for social stability. Without this equality, we get the society of today. A society fragmented by hierarchical authority, exploitation, and chronic conflict. Proudhon responds to those property owners who would claim equality is impossible by demonstrating that it is property that is impossible. Not in the sense that it couldn't exist, clearly the institution of property exists. He's using impossible to mean that it is unworkable and unjust. To prove it, he begins with the axiom, property is the droit d'aubain claimed by the proprietor. Wilbur translates that French term as the right to escheat, the right underlying exploitation, the right that property owners have to take the products of collective force for themselves. As Wilbur explains in Escheat and Anarchy, in common law doctrine, escheat refers to property reverting to the state when an owner dies without heirs, ensuring that property is not left in legal limbo without a recognized owner. Proudhon argues that property itself is based on a form of escheat. Instead of being left in limbo, aka being kept in common, the products of collective force revert to the property owner, the head of the economic body, by virtue of their legal title. This right of escheat manifests in different forms, such as rent, interest, and profit, though each rests on the same principle. The owner receives income from their control over access to property. Underlying this right is the assumption that people can't just cooperate as equals. There must be some stratification, some who command and own, and some who obey and own nothing. Surely every social and economic body must have a head. Anarchists, of course, reject this premise. With the right of escheat understood, Proudhon proceeds to show why property is impossible. First, because it demands something for nothing, as the property owner lives from the labor of others, receiving income through ownership rather than contributing equivalent labor. It is impossible because it is wasteful and parasitic. It drives up the cost of production by forcing workers to perform surplus labor simply to sustain the idle luxury of property owners. Property is impossible because on the individual level, it drives workers into debt and poverty, and on the social level, society devours itself, as property drives competition between workers, creates winners and losers, concentrates wealth into fewer and fewer hands, and results in social breakdown. Property is impossible because it is the mother of tyranny. Competition among property owners trends toward monopoly, and economic power translates into political power, ensuring the rule of the elite. Finally, property is impossible because it demands endless growth, particularly through mechanisms like interest, despite the Earth's finite limits. Taken all together, property is impossible because it cannot achieve the ends by which it justifies itself. It appeals to equality while producing inequality, promises freedom while creating domination, and claims stability while generating crisis. We've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short space of time. The self, social agreement, the treatment of people and of land as property, and Proudhon's critiques of property and its consequences. Now I want to approach the project of rethinking property in the context of anarchist aims, as an exploration of what could be as we undergo the effort to put what has been behind us. Anarchism is a philosophy and practice which opposes relations and systems of command and subordination and proposes the pursuit of anarchy, defined as the realization of relations and systems based on autonomy, mutuality, and free association. For all the aforementioned reasons, anarchism has historically opposed the legal institution of property. Due to the rejection of authority in the sense of command, anarchy would be an illegal order. This means that rather than organizing society around a set of legally prescribed permissions and prohibitions, conflict would be addressed through negotiation, mediation, and other forms of dispute resolution undertaken by those directly involved. Shared norms, expectations, and practices would emerge through experience and continued association, but they would not acquire the character of law, constituting an authority standing above and apart from those who participate in them. Anarchists have historically advocated for a variety of economic arrangements. Communist anarchists begin with the recognition that all wealth is a collective, social product. Each and every one of us relies on the accumulated knowledge and labor of past and present generations. Due to the collective force generated by society as a whole, which includes productive and reproductive labor, it is impossible to precisely measure and reimburse anyone's specific contribution. Thus, in the absence of wage labor, the means of production and the goods necessary for life and well-being should be kept as a common inheritance, as each of us is a shareholder in the human project, or human family. As some communist anarchists might argue, the maxim from each according to their ability to each according to their need is already practiced on the small scale. The challenge is merely scaling that principle to encompass the entire planet. Enrico Malatesta, who I've seen described as the anarchist's anarchist, noted, "Universal communism, a single community of all human beings, is an aspiration, an ideal goal towards which to move, but certainly it could not now take on a concrete form of economic organization, nor probably could it do so for a long time to come. The longer term will be the concern of our descendants. We have a long way to go, if we ever get there." For the record, communist anarchism does not ignore the importance of the individual, and by extension, their possessions. Communist anarchist Emma Goldman wrote, "The individual is the true reality in life. A cosmos in himself, he does not exist for the state, nor for that abstraction called society or the nation, which is only a collection of individuals. One's personal possessions, be they clothes, prosthetics, tools, vehicle, or home, are a critical component of one's agency, even in a fully communist anarchist framework. What communist anarchists call common ownership is perhaps better understood as the freedom of each individual to access, work with, and enjoy the fruits of the means of production without claiming permanent exclusive ownership. Proudhon provides an apt analogy. As the traveller does not appropriate the route which he traverses, so the farmer does not appropriate the field which he sows. Perhaps most of what is now called property is best left in the limbo so feared by the right of Ashtit. While I find much in the communist anarchist tradition compelling, I'm an anarchist without adjectives because I don't think communist arrangements exhaust the economic possibilities opened by the premise of anarchy. Proudhon was also not a communist anarchist. He theorized a synthesis of community and property in an attempt to balance mine and thine, to reconcile the antagonism between what is common and what is personal by balancing individual possession with collective responsibility. In this framework, property is not the rights afforded by title to exploit others, but the ability emerging from free agreement to have secure possession of what is needed for one's own labor, balanced within a larger community. How we get from here to there is a question of strategy, but it helps to have a sense of one's goals before launching blindly into action. That way, a theory and practical experiments are in dialogue rather than flowing in one direction, or worse, completely disconnected. What follows is a mostly speculative exercise, tentatively imagining how anarchy might strike such a balance. In the absence of legal order, where equality of access to the means of life prevails, property, if we even bother with such a loaded term, could become a matter of occupancy and use, reciprocity, and mutual agreement and respect, rather than legal entitlement. Occupancy and use is an oft-referenced standard among mutualists for evaluating what is socially accepted as one's own. If we all agree that everyone should have somewhere to live and do what they wish, actual occupancy and use seems like a reasonable starting point for anarchy. It makes intuitive sense for the places where you live and labor, where you invest most of your time, to be in some sense yours, right? But occupancy and use are not solely an individual standard. Most people do not live or labor alone. We're a social animal. So occupancy and use would include recognition of the social body and not just the individual body. One's house may be recognized as one's possession, but a workshop, a factory, a farm, an office, a park, or an eatery involve multitudes, which may collectively possess such spaces for as long as they associate to occupy and use them. Social bodies arise among people whose lives intersect and who share specific interests. People are embedded in places and interface with their land and infrastructure. Thus, their perspectives naturally carry weight in questions affecting that place. Yet a concern for place does not require isolation from the wider world or subordination to a territorial polity. As Kropotkin recognized, free association is not bound to one's neighborhood. For us, commune no longer means a territorial agglomeration. It is rather a generic name, a synonym for the grouping of equals which knows neither frontiers nor walls. But any attempt at radical social transformation has to begin somewhere. Enduring associations formed around specific interests must take root where people live, grounded in the relationships and ecosystems that sustain them. Recognizing that these associations don't exist in isolation, their labor and its products should be understood within the complex system of production and reproduction, seen and unseen, that sustains us all. If we accept the from each to each principle, then the products of all labor are part of a broader social inheritance. In practice, this might resemble the generalized mode of reciprocity identified by anthropologist Marshall Sahlins in Stone Age economics. Generalized reciprocity refers to a type of exchange of goods and/or services where the giver and the receiver do not keep an exact ledger of value or stipulate the amount or duration of return, as it is expected that the exchange will balance itself over time. This works best in established networks with multiplex relationships. Those are relationships between people that involve multiple overlapping roles, ties, or contexts. For example, your cousin might also be your mechanic, your neighbor, and a close friend. Maybe generalized reciprocity could be universally generalized, extending even to strangers, as is promised by the hypothetical communist anarchist future. Libraries of things show some promise as a prefigurative model. But unless and until that universal attitude becomes the norm, we'll still want to exchange goods and services with strangers too. Balanced reciprocity, as Sahlins identified, obligates the receiver to return, within a time limit, something of equal value. This is the form of reciprocity that could be found in non-capitalist market exchange. Keeping to the standard of occupancy and use, there obviously couldn't be a real estate market or stock market, but products and services could still be exchanged between individuals and associations on mutually agreed terms. While recognizing the big picture of collective force, we may still narrow our consideration to the contributions made within a particular association of workers. In anarchy, and in our efforts toward it, we might see individuals compensated both collectively and individually for their contributions. Collectively, workers could share in the value generated by their association by devoting part of it to common infrastructure, the irreducible minimum, or reinvestment in the association's efforts. Individually, workers may receive remuneration, perhaps facilitated through a mutual credit system, according to some mutually agreed upon criteria which imperfectly recognizes each person's particular contribution. To make it a bit more concrete, take, for example, a hotel. While guests would possess their rooms temporarily, the workers would collectively possess the hotel as an ongoing productive association, as they maintain it, prepare meals, coordinate bookings, and keep it running from day to day. Guests may still pay for their stay, but in keeping with the mutualist principle of cost limit of price, the bill would not include the economic rent extracted by absentee owners solely by virtue of their legal title. Payment would simply remunerate the labor, upkeep, and ongoing operation of the hotel. Of course, a hotel doesn't spawn out of nowhere. Someone or some group must first imagine it, and then associate with others who share an interest in seeing it brought into being to gather the necessary information and resources. This kind of initiative would not be denied by anarchy. The initiators simply wouldn't own the labor of everyone who later joins. The project would be collectively possessed by those who lend their labor. To clear up any confusion, the occupancy and use standard is not an impersonal algorithm. You're not going to lose your home to some nefarious mutualist just because you stepped out for a bit or went on a trip. Every kind of possession has its own pattern of use. Homes are occupied even while their occupants are elsewhere. Orchards and vineyards are occupied even while their crops are ripening between harvests. Occupancy and use are determined according to the commonly recognized pattern of use appropriate to the resource, not by whether someone is physically present at every moment. If we go back to the analogy of seats from earlier in the video, even without a legal title to the seat, we still ask the question, is someone sitting here? As a society, we recognize that someone can still be using a seat even if they've stepped away for a moment. When it comes to housing, we might have an accessible record of occupancy and use so that a newcomer can easily search what's available and what's occupied in a particular area without having to knock on every door. Ultimately, what secures your possession is not a legal title, but social recognition, whether that recognition emerges through free agreement or is imposed by law. Such freedom comes with responsibility. You must weigh your own interests against those of others in order to reach a fair balance. Where reasonable people reach different conclusions, competing claims can be settled through negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or any other mutually accepted process. In some cases, even a simple I cut you choose arrangement may provide the fairest solution. If your possession and use proves ecologically destructive or socially harmful, you can expect other people to respect it. Accordingly, even in an illegal order, you're likely best served by following the golden rule. Occupancy and use rest on reciprocity. If you expect others to take your interests into consideration, you should be willing to do the same for them. Though the incentive to steal or squat would be greatly diminished if people's basic needs were met, it's certainly possible that someone could try to take over your house out of unchecked envy, antipathy, mental illness, or opportunism. It's also possible here and now for someone to break into your house while you're away. But imagine the consequences in the rest of society if such behavior went unanswered. The absence of a property deed or legal order to enforce it does not mean the absence of consequences, both individual and collectively organized. Any society that wishes to maintain social harmony is going to sanction harmful behavior. In an anarchist society, such sanctions are simply decentralized and unbacked by authority, and thus not immune to consequences of their own, which incentivizes careful approaches to harm response and conflict resolution. Anarchy is not something that can be enforced in the way that a law can be enforced. Anarchism does not reject the use of force, since force would be necessary to resist authority and establish an anarchic social order. But enforcement, as in the use of force to uphold legal authority, would be inconsistent with anarchy. We can instead expect customs to emerge through the experience of anarchic social relations. People learn what claims others will recognize, what conduct earns trust, and what behavior invites resistance. Both authority and anarchy depend on widespread social recognition. The difference is that authority ultimately falls back on top-down coercion to secure compliance, whereas anarchy relies on voluntary cooperation, mutual recognition, and diffuse sanctions. I do not believe in some single, ideal economic system. I do not expect as one man to design a universal blueprint. Different systems and norms will emerge from the application of anarchist values to different conditions and problems. And as circumstances change, I expect those systems and norms to evolve as well, just as they have throughout history. As anarchist William Gillis concludes, every social norm, every standard, ultimately originates in the détente between individuals. Society itself is a fabric of social relationships. The result is an organically emergent mesh of agreements, a society without structures of domination and exploitation that fulfills the human need for stability while embodying our mutual responsibility. Our prefigurative economic efforts should be guided accordingly, with a wide variety of projects studying what works and what doesn't to cultivate the building blocks of a post-capitalist transition. At the end of the day, as Malatesta reminds us, what is important and indispensable, indeed the essential departure point, is to ensure that every person has the means to be free. We don't have to have all the answers to get started. We will make the road by walking it. All power to all the people. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks to the seedlings, the saplings, and especially the roots for making all of this possible, including our newest members, Ronald, Noreen, Cojet, and Amachina. You can join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/SaneTrue, or right here on YouTube with a YouTube membership. Check out my other videos for a range of radical topics. Thanks again. Peace.